I think what often gets discounted in this conversation about union decline is how all of these efforts, to break unions and to break the power of collective bargaining, to stall contract negotiations and whatnot. All of that has this underlying effect of breaking what it actually means to be a union, which is to be on one another's side. And so that, I think that dating back, to the mid 20th century, early 20th century was always in the background, and something that employers were trying to do, and also, the Right to Work Committee, for instance, which has been bankrolled by, the Koch brothers and whomever else, really prioritizing, activating those tensions.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fettig. Unions and union membership have been in decline in critical places in the United States for the past couple of decades. And this has had electoral implications with shifting allegiances of the working class, and further down the line, implications for American democracy itself. Labor unions were once the cornerstone of a working class life, especially in Rust Belt communities like Western Pennsylvania. Unions were more than just advocates for fair wages and workplace protections. They were a kind of glue that bound communities together, creating a sense of shared purpose and connection. But over the past several decades, the power of unions has diminished significantly. Deindustrialization, globalization, and concerted efforts to weaken organized labor have eroded the institution, leaving a vacuum in both economic and civic life. In their absence, new forces have emerged to shape the political identities of working-class voters. Forces like conservative organizations, evangelical megachurches, and cultural movements that emphasize issues like gun rights and patriotism over bread and butter issues and civic engagement. This shift has contributed to the growing realignment of many working-class voters away from Democrats and toward the Republican Party, a realignment that's reshaping electoral politics in America and may have played a significant sleeper role in the election of Trump to a second term. So did the decline of unions tip the scales? Could a stronger labor movement have helped Democrats reconnect with disaffected working-class voters? And what does this shift mean for the long-term health of American democracy? I discuss all of this with my guest today, Lainey Newman, co-author of the book Rust Belt Union Blues, which examines the political shift among working-class voters, particularly in Western Pennsylvania, and how the decline of unions as both economic and social institutions has contributed to a growing alignment of working-class voters with conservative politics and the Republican Party. All right, if you like this episode or any episode, please give it a like, share, and follow on your favorite podcast platform, and or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Lainey Newman, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Sean?
I'm doing great as well. And I'm glad to have you here to talk about something that I think, one, I don't know that in my, I guess, quote unquote, analysis of contemporary politics, give a lot of attention to. I'm going to forgive myself for that, because I also think, some of the work that you do, and particularly some of the stuff that you've written about, is stuff that doesn't get a lot of attention by the media in discussing kind of the evolution of our politics, and also an explanation of why we are where we are right now.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to have you here to talk a little bit about it.
Definitely. Yeah.
I think I told you in advance that, I grew up in Wisconsin and I was living there when Scott Walker was the governor. And, he kind of made union busting his mission.
Right.
And I think in retrospect, he largely succeeded. And this was really just part of a larger push, especially in the Midwest, to break the backs of unions, I think.
Yeah.
At that time, I didn't really grasp the importance of it or the potential implications of it. I do think we're seeing it now, though, but I'm not the person that can quite explain what it is. And before we get to how it might have impacted this past November election or the the shape of the electorate today, I guess I'd like a bit
Hmm.
of a better understanding of how we even got here in the first place.
Sure.
So I'm wondering if you could help me understand, a little bit of the history of the decline of unions, how it's kind of shaped electoral politics over time, in what ways, and then how we got to where we are today. And then we can dig in a little bit into where we are today.
Sure. Yeah. So things have changed a lot over the last couple decades, as we talk a bit about in the book. So I guess I'll start by talking about kind of the peak of union membership and union density in the United States, which was in the 1950s when over a third of private sector employees were union members. At that time, private sector employees. So what I mean by that is, people working in coal mines, steel mills, textile factories, any type of corporation, really, not teachers and sort of the public sector union members we think of today. All of those members were sort of in these industries that were historically pretty unregulated and had been pressured by unions and in part by the federal government coming out of the Great Depression to create regulations to protect workplaces. And so there was this big push in the 40s, in the 30s and the 40s to unionize. And that was really sort of at its peak towards the 50s and the 60s as well. Things were still pretty strong. To me, in our research, we document the decline of American labor and the power of American labor, which had been building, building, building. And even though, there wasn't sort of the NLRA or National Labor Relations Act before the Great Depression and that type of thing, there were still movements of unionists and strikes and picket lines and that type of thing. So really, it was building all throughout American history. And we point to the 1970s and particularly the 1980s as the time at which things really begin to change, and there's a precipitous sort of public backlash against unionization efforts, starting with the White House, or I guess at the highest level at the White House, but then also in the private sector and down throughout even unions themselves. And so I would say strength in the 1950s at its highest, and then sort of downhill from there, especially in the 70s and beyond.
So in my preamble, I think I kind of prefaced this idea that the blame for the decline lies at the feet of the Republican Party, but I think that's an overgeneralization. You can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but there's also regional implications to the evolution of unions and unionization. I think about North versus South, which is a
Sure.
common cleave.
Right.
I think about like Bill Clinton when he was the governor of Arkansas. While he paid lip service, he wasn't particularly friendly to unions either.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something else that I think perhaps has influenced the decline of unions. But another is, like I said, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and I come from a working class family. I was raised by a single parent who was not in a union. So that wasn't part of my life.
Sure.
But I was kind of an outsider, and I was going to say I grew up gay, but I didn't. I realized that I was in my late teens. And the reason I even mentioned that is because I always knew that I was voting the same way that unions were, right? And that was pro-democratic or for Democrats. But I always felt like it was kind of strange bedfellows, that we were voting for the same party, but for very different reasons. And I'm wondering if there's something culturally here that was at play for division at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're pointing to a really important drop off, I guess, in terms of the sort of alignment between unions and union members and the Democratic Party, particularly happening in the 1960s with cultural issues. And by that, I mean, racial issues, really, that came between the Democratic Party and unions as early as when Kennedy was in office, really, when there were riots and protests in Philadelphia because contractors weren't hiring any of the companies that had Black members, and unions were sort of blacklisting anyone who wasn't white, not allowing them into membership. I mean, this was going on for a long time, and the Democratic Party, as the party of civil rights in the 1960s, I think that a lot of people view that as the point at which there was this, momentous division, and I do think that that had something to do with the sort of ongoing fragmentation of sort of the union base in the Democratic Party. I don't think that that's the entire answer. But I do think that the cultural issues today we see not so much racial issues, but it's certainly for a long time LGBTQ issues, and today with the trans issues that were at the center of this past election, for sure abortion, gay marriage back in the 2010s. In 2000s. So yeah, absolutely. I think that, people in unions were voting based on this is the party that supports a working class coalition. And then you have a whole other segment of the Democratic Party, which really, I think over recent history has taken over the Democratic Party, that, is more focused on sort of, I guess, identity-based issues.
It's almost hard, I think, to look back in the context of the way that you're explaining this, and this makes absolute sense, but it's almost difficult to look back and imagine, given our understanding of human nature and then the coalitions that the Democratic Party was building and trying to maintain, 40s, 50s, 60s, and forward, it's almost like in hindsight, we could predict that there was going to be some friction at some point. But do you think this is, to some degree, a failure of imagination, where we are, on the part of Democrats, or some type of ingenuity, I would say nefarious ingenuity, on the part of Republicans to kind of irritate that friction?
Oh yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of evidence, I think, that I've seen, and we don't talk about this that much in the book, but just in doing additional research and potentially, for future sort of publications, but that, that Republicans or conservative entities during this time were, and corporate entities as well, were activating these tensions very purposefully. We do touch on that a little bit in the book, but, racial conflict benefited the employer in the mid 20th century. And so I do think that that was something that was, very intentionally recognized by Republicans. I think what often gets discounted in this conversation about union decline is how all of these efforts, to break unions and to break the power of collective bargaining, to stall contract negotiations and whatnot, all of that has this underlying effect of breaking what it actually means to be a union, which is to be on one another's side. And so that, I think that dating back, to the mid 20th century, early 20th century, was always in the background, and something that employers were trying to do, and also, the Right to Work Committee, for instance, which has been bankrolled by, the Koch brothers and whomever else, really prioritizing, activating those tensions.
So if we take this a little bit outside of the realm of solely politics, because it's, it takes a number of factors probably to explain the decline of unions and unionization in the United States. So if we remove politics a little bit and we look at this through the lens of the economy and the evolution of society, is there something about the way that these have changed and the ways in which they impact working class folks' lives such that they also would have or could have contributed to the decline of unions irrespective of the political realm?
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely, as you said, there's tons of factors that went into the decline of unions. And I think a huge one was, just the decline of manufacturing itself, and the decline of the U.S. as sort of the producer of a lot of, raw materials and steel and energy and, coal, things being offshored to other countries, globalization. That's often what people point to in terms of, pinpointing a economic factors that contributed to the decline of organized labor. Obviously, as you mentioned, the South has historically and continues to have very low rates of unionization, and the North has had much higher rates comparatively. There was, a lot of effort by companies internally and from, and foreign investment that, went to the South from the North in order to avoid union labor and union wages. And so, the economic factors that allowed, I guess, the invisible hand that allowed those types of changes to happen, foreign investment and globalization and offshoring and that type of thing, all sort of is part and parcel of union decline happening in the 70s and 80s.
I want to try this question out on you, and it's really oversimplified, so I want to admit that up front. Mm-hmm. I want to pivot a little bit to this election and the impact that, the evolution of unionization has had and how that played out. But to get there, I guess I'm wondering, is it, again, this is an oversimplification, but is it fair to say that many rank and file union members, particularly in the Midwest, are at a point at which they are evaluating their vote more closely aligned to their cultural values than their economic at this point?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think it's a question at the top of mind for a lot of people, and I think that in a certain sense the answer is yes, but I think that it's more than just economic and cultural. So I'm going to complicate the question a bit. I think that one of the things that we talk about a bit in Rust Belt Union Blues is this idea that people have said about how union members who vote for Republicans are voting against, quote unquote, voting against their own best interest. And that comes from the idea, right, that, Democrats support unions and, unions pay better wages, and any worker who sees a union contract and a non-union contract, if they don't know which is which, they're going to always pick the union contract. And so, or even if they do know which is which, essentially, just because of how much better those jobs are, pay and benefits wise. So I think that, that's a line of thinking that I understand, but that we sort of push back on, because we don't see voting as sort of a calculation of, sort of a metric-based calculation of I guess pluses and minuses based on the parties and the candidates. We more see, voting as something that is, informed by one's networks, by the groups of which one is part, the environment, social factors, and relationships, family, everything that goes into someone's identity also goes into, how they vote. And so one thing that I think of is a steel worker, for instance, could say, well, Trump really helped us because he put into place these steel tariffs, which Senator, some Democrats have supported, and that Biden, some of which Biden maintained. Or that same steel worker could say, I'm not going to vote for Trump because he's anti-union labor. So the way that we evaluate, I think, the pros and cons and the economic pros and cons, and I suppose the cultural pros and cons as well, is all sort of informed by by what we're listening to, right? What types of, I guess, which track we're adhering to, whether we're adhering to that track of saying, oh, the tariffs, really helped the steel industry versus, I'm not going to vote for someone who's anti-union labor. And so our theory is that because unions don't occupy a space in people's minds anymore, or in their communities and their family life, that puts, those issues at the top of mind, essentially, as those issues are prioritized in that way, that underlies these decisions that people make.
So you're kind of complicating my next question, and I appreciate you for it, but it is making me wonder how to frame this question. Essentially, what I want to get at is, if it's true that there are other factors in people's lives that are playing a much more salient kind of role in influencing perhaps the relationships that they have, the types of, groups and people that they engage with, the things that they care about, that are perhaps lending themselves to making it easier to vote for a Republican candidate or align with a Republican candidate more so than a Democratic candidate. And in the light of this election and the unique character of Trump, I wonder if irrespective of whether or not unions were present, that there's something about these types of voters or these types of folks that the landscape has shifted so much that if they're in a union or not, they are attracted to these types of politics.
I agree with you there. I think that there has been a shift, in sort of the understanding of who's on the average person's side. If we put ourselves into that position, we're talking about this subset of voters, who's on our side. And I think that, whether people in the mid to late 20th century were members of unions or not, there wasn't the same sort of, I think, paradigm about sort of us versus them that there is now. I think now the them is the elite, like the sort of, I guess, cultural elite that is represented by the elite universities, the, people successful, highly educated, I guess, wealthy, liberal coastal elites versus, the average American who's, concerned about how, what they're going to be able to buy their kids for Christmas, and the prices of eggs going up at Walmart and that type of thing. I think that there's a real sort of sense of just a chasm, really, that people sense between themselves and what is represented as the Democratic Party or what they see as the Democratic Party. And I think that, if we think back to this era of union power, labor power, really, it was the them was the corporate elite. It was more, or that unions were trying to activate, and what they sort of tapped into was, the bosses. Those guys are the ones who are, the other. It's us workers versus, the bosses, and who's going to help the bosses and who's going to help the workers. And so I do think that whole paradigm has definitely shifted. As you said, I do think that has shifted. And I think that in part it shifted because unions aren't occupying that space anymore. That's informing how people are seeing, themselves relative to the rest of society.
Okay, so that's, I guess, where I'd like to go next then, is if we focus on that, the decline of unions as being a significant factor in kind of the morass we're in, how much do you attribute that decline to this political moment, to the election of Trump this year?
Yeah, I think it's contributed hugely. I do. I think that when you look at the electoral map and think about the key swing states right now, and of course this election, there were several, including, North Carolina, Arizona, et cetera. But, the key swing states, everyone was focused on Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and that has been the case for the past several elections. Those were the states that were the epicenter of union power. Really, Western Pennsylvania, Michigan, Detroit, outside of Detroit, Wisconsin, with going back all the way to Lafayette, I think, union leader, storied union leader. And so I do think that, that you can't, it's impossible to ignore the importance of this transition, and this transformation, in terms of, the electoral outcomes.
So one of the things that, in all honesty, reading Rust Belt Union Blues, there was a kind of chilling feeling that came over me when I was reading this, in that I think there's something missed in how we think about this current moment in our politics and how often we attribute this to, or simply being a Trump phenomenon. And I think there's something in reading the book that really got me thinking that this is not solely a Trump phenomenon. Now, he's clearly tapping into something,
Mm-hmm.
and Biden was able to kind of chip away at that in 2020. But
Mm-hmm.
I am starting to have this concern that, especially following this election and the returns suggesting that to these critical voters, these working class voters in the Rust Belt states or in the blue wall, that the Democratic Party is just not speaking to them.
Mm-hmm.
And my fear is that we've turned a corner in such a way because there's nothing on deck. The Democrats aren't really proposing anything. And I want to get to Bernie Sanders a little bit later. And that to me suggests that we're looking at probably a protracted period of time to which these voters, these working class voters, may be lost to the progressive cause or to the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that working class people have, feel, and this is something what we talk about in the book, but that Democrats have just abandoned them, and have prioritized other issues, I guess, economic liberalization in the like laissez-faire way, meaning of liberalization, starting with Clinton, and through the Obama era. Biden sort of went a different direction, I think, than that. But I do think that, the sentiment is that, these areas have really struggled, and the election of Democrats, either on the local level or on the federal level, hasn't saved, the communities, and hasn't saved the good paying jobs. And I see, I mean, I saw that all the time when I was doing this research. It's really sad that, what some of these communities look like. And you can tell that there was a lot of life once there, and that there was a lot lost. And so I think that there is a sentiment that, what was going on for so long, voting for Democrats, unions, the union member and union family, union communities aligning themselves purely, completely with the Democratic Party, and essentially then not getting any what people have seen as anything in return. I do think that the Democratic Party has, done some things for working class people, but clearly it's not felt by a lot of people. So I do agree that I think that it's a lot broader than just, just Trump and this decline. I mean, we document it back to the 70s. Jimmy Carter, didn't bail out the steel industry. Obama did bail out the auto industry, and after the 2008 financial crisis. But I think that, the choice to not bail out the steel industry back in the 70s, that would have now been, seen as a drop in the federal budget, still has ramifications. I mean, you think about the U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel deal that was recently rejected,
Mm-hmm.
but and how essentially that a lot of union members are saying that that's the end of, the U.S. Steel's presence in Western Pennsylvania, because there's sort of no feasible way to come out of that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Basically, I mean, yeah, I think that this goes way back, and that it isn't just Trump, that it's much larger, and that we have a lot to rebuild in these areas if we want to earn back these voters.
Mm-hmm. So I'm taking kind of a circuitous route to where I want to go. So that explains this next question, which is, I feel like the Democratic Party, as much as the Republican Party, but in a very different way, has gone through quite an evolution on its platform in the last decade or so.
Mm-hmm.
And we can blame, Republicans for the us versus them narrative, especially as it relates to queer folks and trans folks.
Mm-hmm.
But we can also blame the Democratic Party, I think, for kind of flailing a little bit in how to maintain their Big Tent. I forgive the Democratic Party for having to do that, but at the same time, it feels like they're flailing. And I feel like we are at a moment in time where, in order for the Democratic Party to kind of rebuild that coalition, they have to somehow find a tentative balance between appeasing, I'm just saying broadly, the working class vote, the union vote, and those that make progressive cultural issues, their top priority. And I feel like that's an incredibly difficult task, if not impossible.
Hmm.
And I wonder if you think there's a way to thread that needle.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think that it is a big problem. I think that, the cultural sort of baggage that Kamala Harris carried, or on some of the sort of progressive issues, was a huge reason why, or a significant reason why, the election went the way that it did. Her seen as, too quote unquote leftist by a lot of people, even though she was pretty moderate on most of the issues, in reality. So I think that there's a couple issues with how the party is set up right now, or sort of the state of the party right now. I would first say that I don't think that there's been there hasn't been sort of a clear sense of direction and leadership in a soul, based on, or a leader, him or herself, since the Obama era. And so I think that that's sort of, since 2012, I think that the party has sort of been trying to find itself. And we had, Biden, who I think was really great for the moment, but wasn't, at a place where he could continue the sort of mission because of age. So I think that that's one thing. I also think that, and I remember sort of reading about this with Clinton, with Bill Clinton, who had sort of a reckoning moment when he was approached by some African American activists, where he basically, said, "I'm on your side, but we also have to recognize that, I have to run a campaign, so I can't talk about all these issues or whatever." I think that one thing that's happened is there's been sort of this a closure of the gap, or of the space between the activists and advocates for certain progressive issues and the party itself, and there's become sort of litmus tests on candidates. Whereas, in previous times, I suppose, the activists would advocate and sort of, activate in about a certain issue, but that, it was the candidates and the party's role to strike that balance between the, activism and, what would be electorally feasible. Because it's just, not true right now that, the broad population supports certain measures. So, politicians can't necessarily come out in support of those measures, even if the progressive community is really sort of passionate about them. And I think that the space between those two sort of groups, has just kind of collapsed, and they're sort of now one. I mean, now, intermingled. And so there's this sort of sense that everyone who's a Democrat has to be 100% on meet all of these sort of checks in terms of cultural issues. So I think that one way to strike that balance, and so I touch on a couple of things here, but one is leadership. Who's the leader of the party? What's the direction of the party? How do we sort of have a vision for the party moving forward? And then second, how do we say, the party needs to focus on electoral success, we and differentiate that from some of the activism on the left.
So I guess that brings me to, if we keep in mind that the message could be at fault, but also the messenger can be a problem, or lack thereof, I suppose. So that brings me to Bernie Sanders, because he was pitching a very populist but working class message, pro-union message, when he was running against Hillary Clinton in 2015, 2016. And I've been mulling this idea, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, but that had Bernie Sanders won, that there was a very real possibility at that moment to have cobbled back together kind of that union vote under the Democratic Party, without what I think under Trump has evolved to include what I consider to be really homophobic, misogynistic, racist, nativist language and rhetoric that is now just seems to be bundled up in this whole movement that seems difficult to disentangle. And I wonder if you think that Bernie Sanders and his message was a better message and messenger that might have averted some of this.
I think that in hindsight, The answer is yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard. It's hard to say, in the moment without knowing, the
Hmm.
future. I think that everyone was so confident in 2016 that a Democrat could beat any Democrat could beat Donald Trump.
Hmm.
That it wasn't a question of whether, sort of we were going to have to stave off this party of various, isms, I guess,
Hmm.
racism, homophobia, etc. And the goal was, I think internally the party had this idea of, the first woman president and all of these different sort of markers, including that, it was Hillary's turn, quote unquote. I think that, the populist and sort of appeal of Bernie Sanders can't be ignored. I mean, that he had a vision for the party. He, clearly was popular, activated people or galvanized people in a way that Hillary didn't. And so, to the extent that the party was sort of mingling in the affairs of sort of or weighing the outcome, I think that was wrong. But that being said, it's hard to think about the counterfactual. I do think that type of leadership of someone who has a very sort of straightforward, no bullshit, talks to the people type of attitude that people sense is genuine. I think that that's a huge thing. Whether a politician comes across as two-faced or duplicitous or whatever, is personality really and appeal is just huge. And so I think that the Democrats should remember that lesson of who's getting people excited, and even if it's not the first choice of the quote unquote core party, that it's really important moving forward that we listen to what's getting people excited, what's galvanizing people.
So we've talked about the types of things that have contributed to the decline of unions and how that brought us to today. But there's another direction to that relationship, which is that the decline of unions also impacts other things. And so these are things that you've written about and you've talked about, things like civic engagement in communities, which in turn influences or can weaken our institutions, which in turn can threaten our democracy. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the decline of unions has contributed to that and what that relationship has looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that unions were part of this sort of interconnected social institutional network in their heyday. So not only unions, but fraternal groups, ethnic clubs, various other civic associations, community centers, or YMCA's, etc., churches, religious institutions, had a much larger role in people's lives. And this goes back to the work of, Bob Putnam with Bowling Alone, in I guess the late 90s that was.
Mm-hmm.
But so, yeah, I mean, so unions were part of that whole fabric of civic engagement, and all of those institutions and organizations sort of built on one another. And that's the thing about grassroots community organizations is, people are in one, and then there's crossover between one and the other. I was just talking to someone who was saying that the pensioners of the local, I think it was I can't remember which local it was for the steelworkers, but some pensioners affiliation of a local union would meet at the Elks Lodge, every month or whatever. And they would hold their meetings there, whereas the union meetings themselves would be at the union hall, and there
Mm-hmm.
was all this sort of crossover, and we talk a lot about that in the book, is documenting crossover between these organizations. And so I think that one thing that the decline of unions has done, and this goes along with simply good paying jobs and people being sort of co-located in one area, the decline of manufacturing as well. People are no longer sort of part of those interconnected communities in the way that they once were. I think unions had the benefit of being sort of workplace mandatory, I suppose. I mean, you could
Mm-hmm.
obviously have opt-outs for various reasons, but It was one organization or civic group that all people who worked for at a certain place were part of. It wasn't based on race or ethnicity or religion or whatever. It was based on workplace, and so it created relationships and a network amongst a lot of different people who had very different backgrounds, and who maybe wouldn't be hanging out at the Slovak club, but went there because their buddy was a member, and then they ended up hanging out there every Sunday to drink beers, which is something that I was told by one of the retirees, that everyone would just go to one another's sort of groups because it was just a place to go and hang out. And so I think those initial connections that were bred by unions, when those no longer exist, that really impacts the sort of ripple effect of civic organizations and how civic organizations can build on one another. So, I mean, in addition to all the economic losses that have happened and democratic erosion from the decline of unions and all that, it's absolutely, I think, the case that civic life has suffered as a result.
I think there's generally been in the lexicon of explanations of why democracy can collapse or may backslide is the story of a decline of civic engagement writ large, irrespective of unions, the rise of social media, the ability for people to kind of engage with each other only in ways that they want and to do it anonymously, that this all has contributed to a chipping away at democracy. And then, that was kind of kickstarted under the pandemic when everybody was at home, required to be at home, right? And I could see where that also would apply to union members as well, right? That same kind of narrative. But if we buy that narrative, I wonder if there's a proactive argument to be made here that strong and robust unions actually contribute to the health of a democracy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is. One thing that unions taught were, sort of democratic norms. The unions were like other organizations, like fraternal groups and others. Unions were federated structures, so that actually, in a lot of ways, like mirrored sort of a governing structure. And so there was education about the democratic, sort of processes on multiple levels. The first was, via the structure of the union and participating in union meetings or at least, elections or whatnot. So that has a democratic component. And then the other is that unions would educate members purposefully and very intentionally about democracy. And so in some of these old union publications that we looked at, there's long form articles about how the United States Department of Treasury works, or what the Attorney General of the United States does, and how to file, and not only those sort of more abstract concepts, but also very sort of particular concepts about how to file for Social Security benefits and what to do if a claim gets denied by an insurer or something like that, like things to help members navigate the landscape of democratic and other political sort of institutions. And so even and one thing that we talk about in the book is just knowledge that was, I guess, spread by unions about completely unrelated things, just that was useful to members. So a lot of people in Western Pennsylvania hunt, and then and now, but so when does the season start? When, what types of, shotguns can you use at this time of the month versus that time of the month? What's the limit on deer that you can take, or shoot? So that type of thing. I mean, things that were useful to people and things that were more abstract. So I think that the education happened on a lot of different levels, subconsciously and consciously. And then there's also, of course, just the sort of integration of all different types of people that you get in a union. And I don't only mean, racially, but I also mean, once women started being accepted into workplaces and, people of different backgrounds. I mean, it used to be a big difference if you were, Irish Catholic versus, someone who German or whatever. Or Italian, and so I think that what you had in these places were unification of interests between very different people, and that went a long way in terms of, uniting people and making them sort of feel like their fellow American was, their friend, and that they, had common interests with them despite their differences.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I found particularly, I want to say striking, but I'm going to use the word striking as an action in a minute. So, what I found particularly interesting in this past election was the schism that seemed to emerge between union leadership and the rank and file, with rank and file being largely supportive of Trump. And I'm just painting with a broad brush here, and union leadership either being torn or pro-democratic. And I live in Seattle, the Seattle area. And so we had the Boeing strike right before the election. And I was really, again, I want to say the word, I was struck by the fact that so many of the striking workers were fervently pro-Trump. And the union leadership was not on the same page, or at least some of them were not on the same page. And I almost feel like to some degree what might be happening here is a bit of a microcosm of what's happening at the larger level in our politics, which is just a backlash against the elite. But I'm wondering if there is an emerging schism between union leadership and rank and file that's having an impact on the effectiveness of unions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there is an increasing schism, though I think that there always has been sort of a separation between the leadership and the rank and file. But I think now the leadership is not as trusted as it once was. There's always sort of been this sense of, we don't want, the union leaders telling us who to vote for. And we found in a 1955 survey of United Steelworkers members that they didn't really think that it was necessary for the union to endorse anyone, that they wanted just sort of information instead of a directive. But I think that now the difference is there has become a sense that amongst many union members that the union leadership or on the executive level out in DC is just a wing of the Democratic Party. They don't even sort of think about the Republicans. They don't consider it. They're just they're in the pocket of the Democratic Party. And they don't care about what the members think either. And so I think that that chasm has emerged in recent years, and particularly accelerated with Trump, and has resulted in people feeling that the leadership isn't listening to the membership. And that poses a really significant problem for unions themselves, how unions run, union structure, because the whole idea is to sort of adhere to the members' interests. So what happens when the members, I guess I was told by one person that, over 2/3 of the UMW workers, so United Mine Workers, support Trump. And I'm sure that was 2020. I don't know what it was 2024, but it probably was similar. What happens when a vast majority of members support the candidate that the union executive level leadership doesn't support? That's a big question. And I think that that's why someone like the Teamsters president decided not to make an endorsement, because, the membership would have essentially discredited that endorsement. Do I think that is the right decision to make? I'm not, it's not clear to me that that's the right decision to make. I heard from a lot of people that the role of the union is to, advise their members on what's best for them and that type of argument. But I do see why a leader would decide to not go against the, sort of broad-based wishes of the membership so directly. And so I do think that that emerging difference between unions, union leadership, often in DC, and the members out, across the country, sort of builds on itself and has in recent years become even more apparent.
What it kind of strikes me is that it's almost as if, so there were exogenous threats to unionization. You kind of explained that evolution, but now it almost feels like the wolf is in the house, in that, if the members are turning against leadership, that feels like a potential existential threat to unionization in and of itself. So it's almost like, not to lay this all at the feet of the Republican Party, but at this point, the membership, the rank and file could finish the job.
Yeah, I mean that's really tough because I think a lot of people feel that, unfortunately, a lot of people feel, workers that I spoke to in my research, don't feel like the union was, benefiting them too much, and I think in their minds, separate the job from the union. What I mean by that is folks who have, union jobs understand that those jobs are good jobs. There's protection, there's often much better benefits, higher wages than a non-union job. But there's often an attribution error that emerges between sort of, why people see that as a good job, which is something that frustrates, I think, a lot of union leadership. But people see the union as sort of extraneous, as unnecessary. And I even had someone tell me, well, now we have OSHA, and now we have, we have these laws that protect us. Why do we need the union to take money out of our pocket? And so I think that sense of, the disaggregation between what unions, bring to the table and, sort of the on the surface, job that's offered by an employer is really problematic. And that's something that, union leadership is concerned about, I think, moving forward.
So earlier I asked you to kind of look back and posed a counterfactual and imagine how that would play out. And I guess now, just quickly, I want to ask you, looking forward, to prognosticate. And I'm a pessimist. I'll just admit that up front. But given what you've studied and the history that you're aware of as it relates to union building and union busting in the United States, and the current moment and where we are, and the behavior of union both at leadership and rank and file levels, what kind of hope do you have that unions can play, a democracy building role in the next decade or so?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to be optimistic, I think, having done this research, and I try to be optimistic, but I probably am more naturally also a pessimist. But I think that one of our goals in this project was to try to figure out what gave unions such power over, and such, sort of loyalty amongst members, amongst, Americans, and why for so long being a union member was a core part of people's identity. I think about one article in a union publication that I read that quoted a member who had passed away recently, who said, my most important possession is my union card. And that type of thing we saw a lot. I mean, not, in various iterations, that the pride in being a union man, and at the time it really was men, for the most part, but the pride in being a union man was really important to people. And that gave unions a lot of power, politically, socially, etc. And when something is so core to one's identity, the political calculus is very different than just sort of pulling on marginal issue stances of a particular candidate, like whether they're going to support future, sort of pro-union legislation or something like that. I mean, in other words, it's a lot more powerful when a union is really core to one's identity than if the union is just saying, well, this person is going to, in the future, probably, if it comes down to it, would vote in a way that would benefit you. If that has nothing to do with, who you are and your community and your family life, etc. And so I think that, one thing that we want out of the project that we did and that we are hoping for is that unions can, I think, and it's not only unions, I know unions have had a really tough time in the last, several decades, but unions and policymakers that support expanded union rights, et cetera, can, build back the sort of power that they had in communities and amongst people, not only in the workplace but outside the workplace, partnering with other organizations and having more of a presence in people's lives than just in the employer-employee relationship in terms of collective bargaining. So I think that's one thing that we saw as something that wasn't really focused on, but was such an important part of what made unions so powerful. Was this sense of loyalty and identity. So I do think that there's a lot of potential, and I think that you see in some unions that really that being more effective and working to a certain extent. I mean, we talked to some members of the IBEW who talked about how the trades have maintained more of a sense of identity because the trade unions. So very basically, when you think about the AFL and CIO, CIO was industrial unions mainly, and the AFL was the trade unions. So the trade unions like IBEW, brick masons, there's lots of plumbers, pipe fitters, etc., that they've maintained more of a sense of identity because it's sort of more of a skill set based organization, and there hasn't been as much expansion into other realms. So the steelworkers, so I'm now a member of the United Auto Workers as a teacher here at Harvard University. Whereas when you think of an auto worker, you don't think of a graduate student at Harvard University, but that a lot of industrial unions have expanded in that sense and have expanded beyond their initial sort of realm, whereas the craft unions haven't. And so I heard from some people that, they think that that's a real strength and that there's a lot more sort of buy-in because it's seen as, this is our group that represents us and that there's a lot of tattoos, even that people get tattoos with their union logo from the craft unions and that type of thing. And I think that to the extent that you can sort of compare how various unions have fared in terms of maintaining a sense of identity and maintaining a presence in people's lives apart from the workplace and that type of thing, you can see where there's benefits and what has worked and what hasn't. And so that is one thing that I think can give us hope, is that maybe in the future we can see how some more unions can build back in this way and become more integral to people's lives using some of the techniques that have been effective for some of these other unions, and techniques that currently aren't in play, but maybe that people innovate, because there's a lot of incredibly talented people in labor, and it's I never want to be sort of just I guess nagging on labor or critiquing them or whatever. I mean, people are working incredibly hard, and so I do think that there is a lot of potential there, and there's excitement. I mean, there's a lot of public support right now, so there's definitely some hope.
Okay, final question. You ready for it?
Yes, I am.
What's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic, but it can be.
Well, let's see. I feel like my life as a student has been taking up most of my time. But one thing that I listen to is the podcast Strict Scrutiny. I recommend that one. I think that it's important. Legal rules seem very abstract and are very abstract, but are often incredibly important. And one of the things that I'm working on in the future is looking at how changing legal rules because of Supreme Court decisions have impacted how unions are able to spend money on community building initiatives. And so, some things that you don't think that, courts should have anything to do with or do have anything to do with, they have something to do with. And so I think that it's important to know about, what's going on in the legal landscape. And so that's a good one. Let's see if I can give another. I really like reading fiction. So right now I am reading the book called The Friend by Sigrid Nunez, which was recommended to me by my mom, and it's really good so far. So I'll also recommend that one. And I don't really watch much TV, but I follow the Pittsburgh Steelers a great deal. So it hasn't been too great over the last couple games, but we're hoping for a turnaround come the playoffs. So, but yeah, those are a couple things I'd say.
You know, I love Strict Scrutiny, and I think those folks are so smart and they're so witty and they're so funny. But I think I sometimes get so caught up in how witty and funny they are that I forget like they're talking about some really weighty stuff, and I'm like, am I just like giggling my way into authoritarianism?
I know. But at a certain point, there has to be humor. I agree. They're fantastic. And I was lucky to work with Kate Shaw a bit for a while, so she's lovely. But they're all great, and sometimes we do have to laugh. So
yeah. Lainey, thanks for taking the time. I think it's a complicated topic, and I think it's one that's going to play out in serious ways over the next decade or so. So thanks for explaining it to me.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
Unions have historically played a vital role in fostering civic engagement, community ties, and a political voice for working class Americans. And their decline has left a void, one that's been filled by forces that often prioritize division and cultural resentment over solidarity and progress. In the absence of strong unions, the working class has become increasingly vulnerable to political manipulation and disinformation. Under a second Trump presidency, the erosion of labor rights and democratic norms probably will accelerate, creating fertile ground for further polarization and authoritarianism. Unions don't just support workers, they sustain democracy itself by fostering participation and equity and accountability. We talk a lot on this podcast about how to preserve democracy, how to identify when it's under threat, and what needs to be done to rebuild an eroding democratic system. One of the focuses of our attention needs to be on revitalizing unions and making their role in our society a priority once again. All right, check back next week for another episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.